It has been 8 months since we last covered my main in this game, that being Wukong of course, and although that guide does feature some builds which are still very much usable nowadays, Wukong recently gained the ability to not only use melee arcanes but also the Acolyte mods on his Primal Fury, so after a long wait we're finally updating the full-on Wukong guide. We're going to cover and break down all his abilities as well as give a bunch of setups. One of them is really unique and I guarantee you have not seen it before and you're not going to want to miss it. We got builds for all sorts of playstyles today and I hope you guys enjoy. But first we have to cover his base kit. As for Wukong's passive, he has the ability to take fatal damage 3 times in one mission. So 3 times in a mission you can die and go invulnerable for 2 seconds and have 50% of your health restored. Upon these 3 total deaths you can receive a specific buff for usually anywhere from a minute to 30 seconds, and these buffs are plucked from a pool of 5 total, so 3 buffs per mission upon death. As for the potential buffs you can receive upon dying, you can receive a 300% elemental damage buff for a minute, invisibility for 30 seconds, invulnerability for 30 seconds, enemies dropping extra loot for a whole minute, and finally orbs are 4 times more effective for an entire minute. This passive is mainly useful in shorter missions because you can just lazy your way through an entire still path mission, die up to 3 times and just not go down. Unfortunately it kind of gives him a bit of a lazy reputation. And his first ability, Celestial Twin, also helps with this narrative unfortunately. Celestial Twin allows Wukong to duplicate himself, creating an AI clone that will fight alongside you using your abilities and weapons. Interestingly, your clone will stay up without draining any energy. It only costs 25 energy to cast and your clone will just stay up permanently until it dies. You can mark an enemy by tapping the ability on an enemy you are staring at. The clone will then target this enemy specifically with a 3 times damage multiplier. Holding out a gun will cause your clone to use their melee weapon. Holding out your melee weapon will cause them to use your gun. If you want to pick whether or not you have them using your primary or secondary, simply equip a secondary for example and then melee and they'll use the secondary, vice versa with primaries. And when you cast your 4th ability Primal Fury, your clone will also equip it. The Celestial Twin will also teleport to where you land upon exiting Cloudwalker and your Cloudwalker will heal them. The armor buff from your 3rd ability Defy also applies to the clone, and all of the weapons and abilities that this clone uses is pretty much your entire Warframe, so all of the mods, arcanes are being used. It is incredibly strong. It can't really AFK missions as well as it used to be able to, although there are certain weapon types that make it stronger. We'll get into weapon options later. Your 2nd ability Cloudwalker is a mobility healing tool. Wukong will enter the clouds, fly around at a very fast pace, and the distance travelled will affect how much you and your clone heal. It also stuns enemies upon the area of cast and landing. This is basically one of the fastest mobility tools in the game. It synergizes really well with keeping both you and your clone alive. Your 3rd ability Defy is your primary form of tankiness or survivability. Wukong will pull out his staff and absorb damage temporarily. This damage is then distributed in a spin attack and any damage accumulated will be added to your total armor value that you get at the end of the attack, capped at a total of 1500 bonus armor. And when you cast this, your clone will also cast it at the same time and gain said armor buff. Your 4th and final skill, Primal Fury, is your exalted weapon. It is Wukong's iconic iron staff, very much like Darth Maul's lightsaber in appearance, hence my little Sith inspired fashion if you've noticed, except this thing will extend in range and in width via its combos. It possesses a really solid spread of crit and status, a decent amount of slash. The unique mechanic worth noting is that the overall range of this staff increases with your combo counter. Building for Prime Reach for example is still beneficial to this weapon as overall you can extend its range, but isn't 100% necessary to build for because if you rock either 2 dexterity arcanes for a large combo duration or Naramon, you can sustain your large combo count for the duration of the mission and have overall a really long staff. And when you cast this, your clone will also equip the staff at the same time, but when you pull out guns, the clone will keep using the staff. Now, to make things a bit more easy to understand and not having to constantly repeat myself or go over the same builds and setups, before we get into said setups, I want to quickly cover a few elements to what we would build for, such as Archon Shards, companions, weapons that you can use with your clone, and of course focus skulls. Because if I address them in this section here, you guys don't have to constantly ask about them later on in the video, especially if you keep seeing the same mods return. This is just me condensing some important details for the setups, so that way there's an entire segment of the video which you can go back to and refer to. Let's start with weapon options for your Wu clone. There are plenty of guns that are really good with Celestial Twin. However, I personally have always found it the best when using beam weapons. My personal favourite primary to run is the Phantasma Prime. It's a heavily status based beam weapon, and as long as you give this thing a bit of bonus range with your X of the slot, your clone is going to shred things from a relatively far distance away. But if you don't want to use a beam weapon, you could also go with something explosive. The Kuva Ogress is another good option. It is a crap ton of base damage and has a huge radius. With and without outside buffs such as Roar, this is going to be a great option for your Wukong as well. Moving on to secondaries, it's the same story. My personal favourites to use would be the Atmos with its Incarnon, not necessarily using the Incarnon form, but the buffs you get from having it equipped. The new Coda Catabolist is also excellent, and then finally the Kuva Nucore. They're all beam weapons and they are incredibly effective at tearing down hordes. The only thing they really lack is a little bit of range. And then finally, as for melee weapons, I really don't think that Wukong is particularly great with any melee weapon outside of using your ult. I think you're better off equipping it with a gun, and if at any point you're trying to give it a melee weapon, just casting your 4 is going to be way more effective than equipping it with anything else, and that's because of the range Primal Fury has access to. I never find myself intentionally equipping a melee weapon on my Celestial Twin, because it usually means it has to get pretty close to the enemy to do any real damage. So yeah, for melees, I just recommend using your ult. Next up, let's talk my Archon Shards. I've gone completely overboard with my Archon Shards, and you don't have to do this in order for these builds to be effective at all, but I've gone with 5 Violet Talforge Shards for the melee critical damage bonus. It is also doubled when you have energy over 500. Like I said, these aren't required, but it is worth noting when you're looking at the damage in the builds. I'm getting a massive crit buff from these. But that's the blessing of a lot of these builds, is in areas where I maybe want to change a few mods around and make things more versatile, you could remove a few of these purple shards and go with something a bit more versatile. This is really here just for the sake of big funny red numbers. As for focus schools, I'm pretty much only using Naramon and Madurai. 90% of the time, it's Naramon, especially if the build is focused on using Primal Fury, even without Prime Reach being used. And then Madurai is used for bonus strength and casting speed. This is mainly used in setups that aren't focused on Primal Fury. And then of course we've got to talk about my companions, and specifically a mod set that relates to my companions. In a lot of today's builds, you will notice me using the Mecha mod set. We've covered this in previous videos, it is amazing. With all 4 of these mods equipped, 2 of them being on your Warframe, 1 on your Kubro and 1 on your Kubro's melee weapon, your companion will mark a target every 15 seconds for 12 seconds. There'll be a little Kubro symbol above the marked target's head, and killing that enemy applies all of the status effects that are applied to them to all enemies within 30 meters. This does a shit ton of damage and synergizes perfectly with Wukong's kit. You will see this Mecha mod set being used in like 50% of today's builds, and every time it's there, it means I'm using my Kubro Doggy McDogface, and he will have Mecha Recharge equipped and then Mecha Overdrive on his melee weapon. So finally, let's move on to the setups. The first one we're going to be looking at is just his base kit with no helmet and how I opt to build for it. I still have a soft spot for his base kit because I absolutely loved his rework. Some obvious inclusions will be the Mecha mod set. Primal Rage is also an organ I use frequently, but where this setup stands out is how I build my Iron Staff. Although the range it has access to from having a high combo count is relatively large, I still like building it for Prime Reach at least. And in this particular build, I'm building for a crap ton of blast, status, and range. You see there's not too much crit in here. We're not going for the big red numbers with like a Raffle Advanced build, which we'll get onto later. You'd be surprised at how much damage this thing can do. Wukong's standstill combo is very strong. His hold forward combo puts a vortex on the ground. But one of the combos you don't want to sleep on, especially when it's combined with influence, is Rolling Boulder Rush. This combo starts with a simple spin of the staff above your head. This will hit multiple times, especially if you have it built for range, and because of the blast procs combined with melee influence, this will insta-delete hordes of enemies. The slams in the latter half of the combo aren't particularly useful, but it's just the initial spin above your head. There's definitely something you should be using, and this simple combination of blast, influence, a lot of status will easily have you tearing through majority of the game's content. Okay, now we're moving on to the really exciting stuff. This is a build that I can't wait to talk about because I've just curated this recently, and it's just one of those setups that took quite a bit of brainstorming to come up with that's not only really effective, but also really fun and something you probably haven't seen before. I don't really know what to call this thing, maybe a Sun God Wukong or a Fire God, I don't know, it just seems a bit more heat and fire based, mainly due to our subzoom, and of course I've matched the fashion. And this build's primary focus is the combination of a very particular helmet as well as modding our Wukong with very specific arcanes. One of them is very new, and that helmet is Nova's Null Star. Nova's Null Star is a damage reduction based ability that will swarm you with antimatter particles. Each one of these particles will give you a percentage of damage reduction, and the helmet version can get you up to 75 total % DR. Combining this with adaptation, of course, and you've got a very tanky Warframe. But at the same time, these projectiles also seek out nearby enemies and deal damage to them in the form of blast. So essentially, the closer you get to enemies, the more your damage reduction decays, but you will be doing a lot of damage at the same time because of those particles, and you can just easily spam recast this thing, and it also doesn't even require power duration in your build. We'll be using this with its augment mod, Neutron Star. This allows your particles to not only proc blast, but also heat damage at the same time. And when you recast, all of your remaining particles will go out and seek enemies with doubled radius. So, because this ability gives us a huge amount of tankiness that stacks with adaptation, we can get rid of our main survival tool, that being Defy. No more need for that bonus armor because we're getting DR. But what this build is also doing is combining with a new arcane called Arcane Hotshot. When Arcane Hotshot is maxed, you'll gain 6% weapon critical chance for 10 seconds when using abilities to inflict heat damage on enemies, and this stacks up to 50 times, meaning that at maximum stacks you'll get a total of 300% bonus crit chance to your weapons, and this also applies to your exalted. Now currently mine is only rank 3 because this arcane is very expensive and rare because you can only buy one per week. So I've had to spend quite a bit of platinum just to get this thing to rank 3, but just know the performance you're seeing in the background is of 200% bonus crit chance and not the maximum of 300. And because we're using the Neutron Star augment, we are constantly proccing this arcane, and if it was max rank we would have a constant 300% bonus crit chance. This means we don't have to pump our Primal Fury full of crit chance. We can opt to build it for more status overall, and then because we're proccing 2 statuses, being Blast and Fire, with our Null Star, Iron Staff being an ability, we can proc even more elements with its mods, and in this case we are getting a total of 7 elements provided from our Warframe, giving us 7 total stacks of our second arcane of choice, being Arcane Impetus. This isn't the maximum stacks you can get with this arcane, but for this build I really enjoy it. We're getting a total of 42% strength and 21% bonus efficiency. It is an optional arcane, and you could probably even min-max it more by adding another element to your stick, but it's giving us bonus strength and efficiency, and it fits nicely within the build. So let me explain what this build is providing. First off, I think Null Star combined with adaptation is a much more tanky setup than just having Defy. Sure, 1500 armor seems like a lot, but in reality I think Wukong is kind of a bit squishier nowadays. I found myself dying and using up his passive way more than I used to, but with this setup that is not the case. The damage reduction overall is much more effective at keeping him alive, and at the same time we get a bunch of AoE damage out of the ability. Those particles seeking enemies out and doing blast and fire is already good, but when you combine this with Primal Fury and your hold forward combo, which creates mini vortexes on the ground, all those particles hitting enemies inside that vortex creates huge AoE nukes, at the same time as proccing your huge crit chance buff from Arcane Hotshot, and then all of these status procs you are providing from your abilities is giving you bonus strength and efficiency from Arcane Impetus, all while at the same time you get to keep your Cloudwalk for healing you and your clone, and we're still using the Mecha mod set in this setup as well. And the Mecha set isn't just good for that damage, you also have Mecha Pulse, which is stepping in for something like Steel Fiber or Umbral Fiber, and you'll also notice in the build I'm using energy conversion, which is a bit unorthodox. If you're going to use this mod, you want to pick up an energy orb before you cast your Primal Fury. As for your other skills, it doesn't matter too much. A bonus 50% strength is also nice on your clone. The reason I'm not using Transient Fortitude to combine with Umbral Intensify here is because we're not running any duration, and that's because Null Star doesn't need any. But for me, I'd like to keep at least 100% duration total, just so my Cloudwalker has a bit of travel time. But if you don't like energy conversion, just throw in Transient Fortitude. The only thing that's really going to take a hit is the distance in which you travel with your Cloudwalker. And just like the last build, I'm also using the same Kubro with the Mecha mods, the Phantasma, the Kuga Nukor, and Naramon. And I can't lie to you, this is absolutely my favourite Wukong setup that I'm using right now, and I can't wait until I get to use it with 300% total crit chance instead of the just 200 from the current rank of my arcane. If you're looking for a new Wukong setup to try that provides not only a large amount of damage reduction, arguably making him more tanky, without giving up any sort of crit chance or damage because of Arcane Hotshot, and then modding your melee for a large amount of status, this is a must-try versatile setup for Wukong, and I can't recommend it enough. Okay, so you knew this build was coming. We have to include Raffle Advance in here, and not just because it is an incredible Helminth subsume for a Wukong build and pretty much any melee Exalter weapon, but I just love hitting red crits on Primal Fury, and I can't help but show this build off because I actually use this probably more than the previous one, at least before I made the previous build. The Raffle Advance would be my #1 recommended subsume on Wukong, and that's purely due to the efficiency it provides to its overall DPS, especially being that we can combine it with some of the new available Acolyte mods and of course the BS of melee influence, surprise surprise. The idea behind this build is to purely focus on hitting massive red crit numbers in a wide radius. Wukong's slide attacks have always been insane on Primal Fury, but now they're 100% back due to the range available with melee influence. Not only are Weeping Wounds and Blood Rush now available, but so is Maiming Strike. Of course, Maiming Strike isn't 100% required to make this setup good, but because we're spamming slide attacks with melee influence and then stacking even more crit with something like Raffle Advance, it's just fun to build for a little bit of overkill on the crit. The range in which this build kills is so wide and fast that we don't really need the Wu clone. So Celestial Twin is my choice to subsume it off for Raffle. We're keeping Defy for our survivability. I'm simply spamming slide attacks everywhere. This is a super cheesy setup, but admittedly it's one that I do love to use. Although I would recommend using it sparingly if you're going to spam slide attacks because you might get arthritis. You also notice I'm not actually using any elements outside of electricity on my Primal Fury. You're mostly just going to be spreading influence and a shit ton of slash damage. And it's also worth noting that for a build like this, you probably don't really need the Mecha mod set. So your companion could be different because we're not running viral on our Primal Fury. You could throw in a Panzervolt Profiler to spread viral. There's not too much to say about this build, you guys have all seen it before. And it's really just a slight twist on the previous Raffle Advance builds I've showed on the channel. The main difference here is that we're now using a bit more range, less elements, and focusing on Maiming Strike. Okay, so moving on to the latter half of the build, we've got 3 setups which are a bit more useful in shorter missions, setups that are going to allow you to fly through most of the base still path content without going too endless per se. These are super efficient setups that are really fun to use, and we're going to quickly start with a returning setup from the previous Wukong guide, which hasn't received too many changes. And that's my non-Primal Fury build where we use Raw over Primal Fury. This build is of course based around just using your clone, your mobility, tankiness, and buffing your weapons. But the way I like to utilize it is by combining not only the speed in which he has with Cloudwalker, but also throwing on parkour velocity in the form of one of my favorite arcanes in the game, that being Arcane Agility. Agility gives you massive amounts of parkour speed whenever you take damage, and something about the way this build plays, especially when you're using it in the escalation mode, this brings a type of fun to Wukong that feels very much like that scene in Kung Fu Panda where Tai Lung is like yeeting himself up the prison. It's not that the arcane has any particular synergy with Cloudwalker, it's just the fact you constantly have access to such insane levels of mobility. I love fast Warframes and Wukong already ticks that box, but this just takes it to a whole new level, especially when you look at my melee weapon where we're of course combining it with the Praedos, which is going to grant us even more parkour velocity. I do like using the Phantasma as stated earlier a lot with this build. Pretty much all of the weapons I use for my Wu clone have already been gone over in the previous section of the video. And another arcane worth noting is Arcane Camisado. Because we're using Celestial Twin here, we can make use of it. It'll give you bonus strength and increase the speed of your clone when it does damage, essentially allowing your clone to also keep up the pace with you. To be honest, this build is purely for fun, but if you do want to get rid of his Primal Fury, which is less optimal now because of how strong it is, this is a combination I'd recommend you try, and is my go-to when I want to get through a mission extremely quickly. Of course, this wouldn't be a Wukong video without addressing slams. Slam Wukong is kind of a dying breed now ever since they nerfed it. In case you are unaware, you can no longer spam Cloudwalker into heavy attack slams because there's now a little cooldown period where you can't recast your Cloudwalker. However, it still is a really strong combo, and I'd argue that the ability to put Acolyte mods and Arcanes onto your Primal Fury makes your ult way more usable in a slam format outside of just using particular slam weapons. You can hit some incredible numbers with Primal Fury on heavy attack slams now, and I don't have to run influence, which I know plenty of you guys will be happy about, although I'll be the first to admit this isn't exactly my favourite build. As a Wukong enjoyer, I haven't really ever loved the slam builds. They're a bit gimmicky and fun to use here and there, but I am aware this build is not only obnoxious to other players. To be fair, I just think the slam builds get a bit repetitive to play anyway. Regardless, I have to make a build for this, and if you haven't tried Primal Fury with slam builds yet, you might just be missing out. But to keep on theme, I'm also using a particular melee weapon for the same setup. In the past, I've been using the Furax Wraith, and nothing really changes here. I think the Furax Wraith, especially with its incarnate, is an incredible slam weapon. You could go with the obvious of the Archititron, but me personally, I just don't really like the slow speed of the hammers, and the Furax Wraith hits some incredible numbers regardless. An important mod worth noting that you really want to use on your slam build is Galvanized Reflex. This is going to allow you to constantly stay at a 5 times combo multiplier regardless of how many times you heavy attack slam. It will not deplete, meaning you always have 5 times damage. But here we finally have an instance where using Naramon is irrelevant, and you should probably go with Madurai instead, because you're not going to be able to increase that combo if you're constantly heavy attack slamming. So Madurai with the bonus strength and casting speed is better for this setup. As for my subsume, you can really go with Nourish, to be honest, but I've chosen to go with Zaku's Whisper just because it's something I don't use often and it's honestly a nice little switch up. Realistically, if you're going with a slam build, you just want any damage buffing ability thrown in your build. Any way you can increase the maximum damage of your slams. Same reason I'm not using Nourish, because it's already on a different build which we'll be looking at after this. Because I do like using the Primal Fury, I'm using the Primal Rage Augment just for more crit on those slams. The Naira mods are here to increase my overall slam damage, and then because we're running full Umbral, we're getting a lot of HP, so throwing on Arcane Bellicose is actually really nice for bonus strength, thus increasing the amount of damage we get from whatever buff subsume we choose. And on our Primal Fury slam setup we are running Blast, and then we have Corrosive in the form of melee exposure instead of melee influence once. You can all rejoice, finally a different arcane. Because we're going to be casting Cloudwalker a decent amount, this arcane will be active most of the time, and Blast Corrosive is an incredible combo for slams. And when comparing the Furex Wraith slams to Primal Fury often hits way higher numbers than most slam builds out there, and that's due to the new access to those arcanes, being that it now can compete with all of those incredible slam weapons. So although the speed of spamming Cloudwalker is reduced, Primal Fury is now a much more viable slam candidate. And onto our final build. I had to save this one till last because it is boring and you guys all know about it. There's nothing revolutionary about throwing Nourish on a build, but there's also no denying it's extremely effective, and this is the Nourish setup where I'm replacing Defy for Nourish. So as you can imagine, this build doesn't really have too much going for its survivability. It is purely based on maximum damage and DPS. All you're really achieving with this build is a large energy gain due to Nourish, and then having Viral equipped on your Primal Fury due to that damage buff. Not only is it one of the best elements in the game, but then you can just mod your Primal Fury for something completely different. If you're modding for Influence, then the two elements you're probably best choosing between is Blast or Gas for huge amounts of AoE damage. Proccing Viral at the same time as Gas or Blast and spreading it with Influence is just so broken. But like I said, it's lacking survivability, so I really only use this for shorter missions. But even then, your passive can carry you through some of the tougher enemies. I can't sit here and pretend like I don't use some of the best subsumes in the game. Nourish is fantastic within Wukong's builds, and whether or not you choose to subsume off Defy or Celestial Twin, maybe even Cloudwalker, is up to you, but you really can't go wrong with this subsume, unless I have to include it in the video, albeit show it off last place where it deserves to be. This is another one of those builds where we're not using Prime Reach, but we will get our range up on our Primal Fury once we build up our combo with Naramon. We also notice there's no Mecha Set mods in here, and it probably is worth using something like a Nautilus to group enemies, that way pulling them in closer, so if your range isn't built up yet, you can still kill hordes. And I also need to address the lack of using Melee Vortex in this video. In my honest opinion, Melee Vortex is completely useless on Primal Fury, and that's because it already has it built in. Your hold forward combo with Primal Fury slams the ground and leaves a mini Vortex on the ground, and this is actually quite reliable to pull off in game, so Melee Vortex is completely useless because of that, hence why there was no usage of it today. And that about does it for my updated Wukong guide and builds. Let me know how you guys are on your Wukong, and if you tried any of these setups, especially the Sun God Wukong, I highly recommend you try that build out, especially if you're looking for something that's both effective, refreshing and fun on Wukong. I had a ton of fun theory crafting that one. Hopefully you found the video useful. If so, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. If not, then no worries. I appreciate you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.